Welcome back to the Lanterne Rouge Cycling Podcast for our first episode of our Masterclass series in partnership with Join Cycling, our show partner, bringing you research, insights, information, and on-the-ground knowledge from the professional peloton applied to amateur cyclists. Something different for your off-season. This is the first of those. We're going to be talking to 8 or 9 experts in their field, myself and Jim Berg from Join Cycling, about a variety of topics. It's supposed to be like a capsule, a masterclass for all you need to know, the basics and even some details of the most important topics in cycling and cycling performance, whether that's setting a goal, executing a workout, strength training, training methodologies and planning, nutrition. We're talking to Tim Podlegar, David Bailey, Johnny Whale, Peter Shep from EF Education Easy Post, all the experts or some of the best experts that we know in our network. We're trying to bring the info to you. And today's episode is with David Bailey on data analysis and performance metrics, how to actually look at your file on Strava or your workout on Join, how to actually analyze your ride or your block of training. David was head of performance at BMC Racing Team, then Bahrain Victorious, including their 2021 huge year. And since the end of 2021, he's been the head of performance support at Israel Premier Tech, one of the most successful teams this year in terms of results to budget, I would say, especially for a pro team, winning multiple World Tour stage races and indeed Flesh Wallone. He has a PhD and Master of Science from Loughborough University, and he's going to be telling us what really to look for when you're analyzing your rides. So it's a great conversation, lots of basics, very detailed. If you enjoy it, you can check out more episodes through the landing page in the show notes down below for the episodes coming up so you know what to expect. Welcome to the Lanterne Rouge Cycling Podcast. David Bailey and Jim Berg's back again. We're going to be talking about data analysis and performance metrics in cycling. We're going to go basics and then get a little bit into the detail as well. I know everybody's interested in, I think, or maybe not interested in necessarily the basics, but then you think about it, and I realized this morning when I saw the show notes, I don't actually know how power is calculated. I think I do. I like analyzing power. I look at power data all day. And then the basics of how the physics of power is calculated on a bike and how torque and cadence works. Even that, I have no idea at all. So we've brought in an expert to let us know that. We're going to be talking about how to analyze a single ride, how to analyze a block of training. Is FTP dead? I know that's a particular favorite topic of Jim that he wants to discuss, as well as physiological metrics. Is VO2 relevant to the amateur cyclist? Heart rate, should you be tracking it? And just also the nuts and bolts of what tools you should use or could use for data analysis if you want to do that in your own time. But David, what's on your agenda at the moment? Are you in busy off-season planning for 2025 for Israel Premier Tech?
Yep. Hi everyone. Thanks for the invite to come on here. Yeah, it's a funny transition time of year. We just finished out on rider reviews, so as we'll speak about today, we capture a lot of data through the year, and we compile all that. And we have checkpoints in the year, but we've just gone through season reviews for all of our riders. And then, our attention starts to focus now on the off-season and then planning for next year.
Yeah, Tour de France route reveal yesterday, so that's sort of everyone waits to see what that is, and then they can be like, all right, what riders should we send to the Tour? And then what riders can we send to the other races? That's kind of how it works for every team. But sort of number one, you said you're capturing a lot of data for the riders, and I guess power is the basis of almost everything in cycling. Even when you talk about heart rate, it's then derived from how it relates to power. What is power, and how is it captured?
Well, power in its simplest form is a measure of external work or external load, right? So cycling's pretty unique. It's probably closer to motorsport than it is to other endurance sports in that we can capture a lot of data because there's a bike, a piece of equipment that we use, and you can instrument that. I know now, even nowadays, we can instrument the humans. There's lots of wearable tech. But in this case, power's been around, sort of new on the scene when I started in cycling almost 20 years ago. It was all wired technology, but fundamentally, it's a force transducer, an electrical device that attaches to a particular point on the bike to measure strain. So how much load is going through that. So if you think about it, when you're cycling on a bike, you're putting strain through the pedals, through the cranks, and through the frame itself. But in reality, the closer it is to where the biological system, the rider, is putting force on the bike, the better. So that's why they're pedal-based and crank-based power meters. And then it's not measuring, particularly high force. It's not visible, but it's actually a very sensitive tool. And that force in an angular sensor when you pedal is torque. And then you want to understand what the rate of that force production is. So that's angular velocity, or what we would refer to as cadence. So when you've got a power meter and you've got that attached to your computer, your Garmin head unit, what you're seeing as an instantaneous power is the average throughout that cycle. You can actually tease out the power per degree of revolution, but that's not necessarily, maybe if you're working in track sprinting, it's a bit more detailed. But in this case, what you're actually seeing is the average per revolution. And then, of course, that's averaged then over time, depending upon what intervals you're doing or how long you're riding your bike.
And I always see like the calorie or kilojoule derivation from the power, and that assumes the actual physiological efficiency or internal cost. There's a 0.24 ratio between what your body's actually doing and the power reading on the pedals? Could you kind of explain that relationship?
Exactly, yeah. So you're absolutely right. If we're looking at a function of efficiency, I think the highest ever recorded is close to 24%. So we generally lose when we rate the energy required to generate force, we lose 3/4 of it through heat. So what that means, it just happens as a coincidence, a relationship of converting kilocalories to kilojoules to kilocalories sort of accounts for that. So you get a rough estimate when you're measuring power directly of what that's representing in terms of kilojoules as a function of energy, or kilocalories if you want a more specific dietary reference to it. So it gives you an idea of energy expenditure, yes.
And in your experience, and Jim as well, do you think it's safe to assume like a relatively consistent efficiency between people, or even within, say, an event?
Sorry, Jim, go ahead.
No, sorry. Yeah, that's kind of a difficult one, because we know actually that these efficiency levels, they can differ between people, but also within an activity. You might not be as efficient after a couple of VO2 max intervals as you are in the beginning of your workout. So what you're aiming at, the kJs, the kilojoules that you see at the end of your ride, that's kind of an estimation based on the power numbers and based on an efficiency number. But we kind of estimate it. And then again, of course, we know it's somewhere around 80, 90. 24% is really exceptional, being that efficient. For most people, like 20% or something is fine.
And so it's probably too difficult to really try and figure out your own efficiency. So it's better. It's one of those, it's not a low-hanging fruit, so don't worry about it too much.
I would say that, but it is possible, like in a lab, based on your oxygen consumption. Okay. You can calculate it basically, but it can change. It can change during your whole training progression over years. It can change a bit, but it can also change within an activity. So, but it won't change between 10% to 30% or something like that. Okay. So don't worry.
And speaking of actual physiological cost, or a metric to better represent that, so you've got average power, which is how your the torque and cadence over time. But then what is normalized power, David?
So normalized power is something coined by the folks behind Training Peaks, and what it's trying to address is that average power doesn't necessarily reflect a standard ride. You go out on your bike, you descend for 20 minutes twice, or there's rolling terrain, or you're in the group. So power is pretty variable. You'll notice that compared to something like heart rate, which is more of a lagging measure. Power is like a square wave. You push on the pedals, your power goes up. You stop pushing, it drops directly. But physiologically, that's not what works, right? So if you do a sprint, you might only get credit for that 10-second sprint in terms of average power. But then, of course, physiologically, there's an after effect. So when you're trying to understand the physiological demands, normalized power is an algorithm, but in simple terms, it's trying to smooth the data out to better reflect those physiological demands. So they apply a 30-second rolling average and do some other mathematical things to try and give a better representation of the physiological demands as a function of power.
And when you look at an athlete's ride, and the World Championships are a good example of that, because the normalized power data that came out of the recent World Championships was outrageous. Are you then saying, okay, normalized power better represents the physiological cost? When I analyze a ride, I look at that? Or are you more looking at the combination of, okay, this is the average power, wow, the normalized power is really, really different or really close together? Are you more looking at just as another data point rather than I use normalized power because it better represents the physiological demands?
Yeah, it depends on the demands of the event, right? So if it's a flat time trial, average power is probably quite close to normalized power. Yep. If there's not too many corners or descents and things. You speak to another metric that Training Peaks has coined called variability index, which is normalized power divided by average power. So what we're trying to do is understand, okay, how variable was the intensity? How many surges were there? How close to it? So if you have a value of 1, then your average power is tight and normalized power. But if it goes above 1, so for example, something like a mountain bike race is really high variability because these guys have got high spikes and they're doing short climbs and up and down. So that's dependent upon what we're looking at. So if we're trying to understand how variable it was and what the demands were, then normalized power is a little bit better representative than average.
Should you then care about the specificity of your training versus the event when it comes to, the intensity factor or variability index? Like, for example, do you need to be having rides with a big variability index if you're trying to do a 10? Everyone in Britain does, at least what I see on Instagram, they do the 10 mile TTs on the A roads. Looks grim, but they love it. Where you, like you say, you should have a 1-to-1. Do they need to be doing, or the converse is a mountain bike event, like you said, their training needs to have high variability?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's crux to this whole discussion. It's understanding the balance or your philosophy underpinning how you analyze performance, how you train for performance. And I've come from a philosophy of quantifying performance demands. So what is it you're trying to achieve? That's it's a little bit easier in cycling. Like I said, we've got a lot of metrics and lots of devices to capture that. And of course, training specificity is well understood and well accepted as being the most appropriate way to train. You don't train for a marathon by doing 100-meter sprints. So in a very simple way, yeah, absolutely. You should be trying to target the demands of the event and reflect those demands in training. But at the same time, when you break down training, then you'll have justification for different types of sessions that may be more specific to that event or might be quite different because you're trying to build general endurance or a particular component of racing, like peak power for 5 minutes, for example.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Because, like, for instance, with a guy I train, Taco van der Hoorn, we try to win races being in breakaways, and being in a breakaway the whole day, and normalized power doesn't differ that much from average power, basically. And it's all about breaking down the demands and based on whatever kind of workout you're aiming for, whatever kind of outcome you're aiming for, trying to mimic that as much as possible. That being said, that's actually, in my opinion, the beauty of cycling. Like, it's not speed skating, it's not always a time trial. It's not always uphill. It's not always, even if you want to be in a breakaway, I mean, you first need to get there, for example. It's not only about pushing power in front. So there's so much components there that, breaking it down and emphasizing or making certain parts more important than other, that's what you're trying to do in building training plans, but also like analyzing if we are still on track.
I think that's really a key point that I'd like to drive home is, understanding the specificity of your event, not just, okay, I need to place X, especially if it's, a gravel event, maybe it's more like a time trial, but especially a road event, a road race event where there's different dynamics, not just looking at the total I need to do 250 watts to come X position in Grafton to Inverell, big Australian race. It's like break down the actual event into the components. Okay, there's a 30-minute climb here. I'm going to be drafting the 30 minutes beforehand. And so if you average that out into one average power number, that's not really telling you what you need to do to stay in the front group. That's a very basic example, but you're right. It's like, especially doing road racing, the specificity of what you're doing within the race is really important to think about. And that's also what I think about when I look at riders, is that, yeah, like all the riders we see in World Tour now, there's not so many one-dimensional riders anymore. I would say the pure climber doesn't exist almost anymore. The Ruhanos of the world, like Ivan Sosa, poor guy, just went back down to Pro Conti. Like they're all around now. So
yeah, I think like cycling in general is getting like more dynamic. Even if there's like a mountain stage with a big uphill finish, if Pogacar attacks like 3 climbs before, everyone has a problem, right? So basically what we've been seeing over the past few years, anything can happen in whatever race, whether it's flat, whether it's uphill finish. So yeah, the peloton needs to adapt basically in being more dynamic, more versatile.
Yeah. Okay, so that's how to maybe look at a single ride. You got power, but then also your normalized power. How much do you, maybe on a ride by ride basis, would you be looking at an athlete's heart rate data when analyzing a single ride, David?
Yeah, I guess as much as power.
Okay.
I mean, it gets labeled as a bit of an old school methodology, and yeah, there are certainly some sports where that's a bit more fundamental, where you can't measure power or load in the same way we can in cycling. But yeah, quite frequently if you think of power as that square wave response, like you push on the pedals, you get the response, and then you stop, and then it goes. Heart rate's the other end of the spectrum. It's lagging. Yeah, so if you do a 2-minute effort on the bike, it takes a while for your heart rate to get up to a steady state, 2 to 4 minutes, depending on how fit you are. But it stays elevated. So it's the sort of other end of the spectrum. It's a bit more representative of the physiological strain of an effort or of a training ride. And in addition to that, it's actually got a lot more weight and value in monitoring recovery. There's plenty of wearable tech out there that looks at heart rate, resting heart rate variability. So it has its place. It's a slightly different basis, but it has its place and something we look at daily.
And then across a season or like a block of training, are you looking at it even as well to see how an athlete's responding maybe to the same power?
Absolutely, yeah. The one caveat to that is that heart rate is also an indication of autonomic nervous system function. So in a very simplistic term, like how your body's central nervous system is responding. So that's why it's been used a bit in recovery. My point here is that it can vary quite a lot based on that. It can vary on how much sleep you've had, what you've eaten, if you've had caffeine, for example. So all these things should be taken into account when you're looking at it over time. So absolutely, there's good evidence to show the relationship between heart rate and power, and as a measure of efficiency, if you like, and then also linked to kind of fatigue resistance. So does heart rate decouple a bit? Does it drift away from power compared to early in the ride? But all of those things should be taken into consideration against, like I say, recovery, nutrition, and even environmental conditions. One thing we use heart rate for as a subjective guide for riders that go to an altitude camp in the first days, they may look more at heart rate because we know altitude has an impact on performance and power output, whereas heart rate can be a better representation of that, whereas your power meter doesn't adapt because you're taking your bike to 2,000 meters.
Okay, and also heat training seems to be really, really popular. It used to be popular when I saw before in Olympics, say, Tony Martin in a bathroom doing it to sort of adapt to the heat of the event that was expected, but now heat training is done to prolong the effects of altitude when they return to sea level. A lot more is when riders are training in the heat. Are you, like, say you lower the I'm particularly interested in this as an Australian, and maybe I'm being a bit selfish because I'm about to be in the heat in a week, so I want to know, if you lower the, say, prescribed intervals for altitude, are you doing the same thing with when riders are going to the heat? If they're riding in, I don't know, in the Vuelta or before the Vuelta, or they're training in summer, are you looking at heart rate to determine that?
Yeah, it's a big question. Heat has got more popular. Ultimately, it's more practical than going to altitude, right? It's and it's something that you can kind of turn on and off quite easily. I know you have hypoxic chambers; you can turn them on and off. But once you're at altitude, if you're not on a mountain, then you've got to drive all the way down to the sea level if you want to adjust your training load, training stress. But yeah, going back to heat. So first of all, when you think about heat, don't think of it just as temperature. Think of it as the combination of humidity and temperature. So there is a measure, wet bulb globe temperature, so which better represents the combination of radiant heat as well as humidity. And that's why like a race in the Middle East, like the UAE Tour, is a different heat load to somewhere like Tour Down Under. So where the humidity is higher, it presents a bigger stress. On top of that, adaptation is important to consider. We know that after a week or two at altitude, you've adapted, your body's physiological system's adapted to the lack of oxygen, and therefore you can start to adjust the training loads to be a bit more reflective of what you do at sea level. Heat adaptation is much quicker. Maybe as quickly as a week, you start to get increased sweating and better management of heat. It's also a bit perceptual too with heat. Often that's why people go in these ridiculous heat rooms and put painting decorator suits on to increase core temperature, not just to get the benefits, but also to tolerate it better, because as we know, the mind is important when you're exercising in extreme conditions. But yeah, going back to your question, so heart rate is useful, except heart rate can drift. So as you dehydrate through sweating, your heart rate is a function of, it's cardiac output, so how much blood your heart's beating in liters per minute, which is heart rate times how much it pumps per beat, stroke volume. So as your stroke volume goes down, the blood volume goes down because you're losing the water part through sweating. Your heart rate will compensate by going up to maintain the same blood output. So yeah, it's an important tool, and it's useful to remember that when exercising in the heat, certainly in the first week when you go back to Australia, Patrick.
But so the heart rate drift in a ride, I always thought that then, what's the metric where you calculate the average heart rate in the second half of the ride, or the relationship to power to calculate drift?
Decoupling, yeah.
Decoupling. So that if that's could be a function of dehydration rather than fatigue resistance, is that something to really bear in mind when you're looking at that you might not be less fatigue resistant, you just got dehydrated on your 4-hour ride?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Or both.
Okay.
So the thing is, like with heart rate, we, like you just explained really, really nicely, like in cycling, we are not only looking at this external load, we like to know that internal load as well. And but the problem with heart rate, and which is also a good thing, like because it's part of the autonomic nervous system, like you don't want to like consciously make sure that your heart rate goes up and down, right? So you would like that to be just autonomous, being covered. And then the problem with a couple of those things, that there can be like a lot of variables at play at the same time. And I think also there we kind of make the distinction between, like, for example, what you're doing with data analysis of pro riders, where we can dive into all the data, and where also the pro rider has kind of this psychosomatic feedback himself or herself about, hey, I'm at altitude, so it makes sense that my heart rate is a bit higher, or hey, I just took a bottle. I'm shy of a bottle, and I didn't drink enough, so my heart rate is a bit higher. Or hey, I noticed that my endurance capacity is not quite there after 5 hours, so I get a bit of heart rate drift. And with a lot of recreational cyclists, I see actually the opposite happening, and they're often thinking that there should be like a fixed ratio between like power and heart rate, and that there should always be the same. And once it's off, it's like, whoa, what is happening here? But it can be like completely normal, because it can be, because of dehydration, because of altitude, because of caffeine, because of lack of sleep, because of whatever, basically. And that's where I see like a lot of recreational cyclists tend to sometimes spin their head a bit too much about like, okay, this fixed ratio between, they try, for example, to stay in the same heart rate zone and power zone all the time, which is humanly impossible for most people, unless those zones are that wide that I don't know what you're doing, but you know what I mean? So for a lot of recreational cyclists, I would do say like, okay, focus on, for example, the objective of your workout based on power. And then it's still really nice to use heart rate in your analysis. And don't try to do a workout based on heart rate and power at the same time. That's where a lot of recreationals or amateur cyclists sometimes try to make it a bit too complicated, because that's just difficult, in my opinion.
And so when we've spoken about how to analyze a ride or even do a ride just then, but when analyzing a block of training, or even take us back a step, David, if you're looking at this is a rider, or I'm a rider, wanting to analyze myself, how does one go about first evaluating who am I, what are my strengths and weaknesses, what do I need to improve?
Yeah, so the scientific term of that is, what's your phenotype? So how does your genetic ingredients represent you as a professional cyclist or a cyclist? And that's ultimately and fundamentally down to who your parents were. But then in reality, it's then how that environment interacts. So the training you're doing, your nutrition and things like that. So because we can capture your physiological performance or your power output, we can look at how that relate that to how that tracks with the demands of cycling. So are you a stronger, more powerful athlete for short duration, a sprinter? Do you have a better tendency towards prolonged, hours and hours of sustaining power, and that's your endurance performance? And then you have things like your ability to tolerate repeated effort, so your tolerance capacity to make repeated accelerations, which is quite representative of cycling. And also your threshold power. So it's what's typically referred to, if you look at professionals in Grand Tours, it's their ability to sustain a given power output for an extended period of time, which is typically referred to as threshold power. So that's what you would look at, and then you'd measure that against what your performance objective was, the demands of that event you're trying to achieve, and then try and figure out, one, whether you're suited to that, and where you're suited to that, to build on those things with training.
And say you don't have a specific event. Say you're just trying to get generally better on the bike. What would be the metrics you would track to see I am getting generally better on the bike? Because would it be your whole power curve, or would you just look at your 5-minute test, or what would you look at to track that?
It's a good question, because I think that's probably more relevant to most amateur cyclists than a particular performance. That's one of the things I'm really lucky of, and that simply means that we know what they're aiming at, so we can measure that and we can help support that. Whereas if you're just trying to do it for your general health and fitness, the ultimate answer is really up to you. I guess if you're taking part in cycling, you're generally concerned about your fitness and ability to complete training in the mountains, on the flat, and then that's when you look at the power curve there. So you say, okay, where I live, I need to be able to climb 30 minutes, and where I live in flatter part of the world, it's more shorter duration efforts. In fact, I'm a great believer that power duration curve, so your peak powers at time intervals from 1 second to 5 hours, is often driven by where you live. I live in a mountainous area, and a lot of people here generally have good thresholds, sort of 10 minutes or more, but they're not so good at those accelerations, sprints to town signs or drags over highways on bridges. Whereas the people who live in Denmark, for example, they're good at that, and they're less. So sometimes that's what reflects, that's that environmental piece. But if you look at that and you're not too concerned about what the performance you're after is, then you can see that's where it's come from. If you want to work a bit more on shorter duration work, then 5 minutes or less. But it's a good metric to follow.
That's an interesting point, what you said about your environment, because in Brisbane, it's all like 1-minute climbs or really short, punchy climbs. There's no real long climbs. Here in Andorra, it's the opposite. You don't do 1-minute climbs, but it also makes me think of the pros. 2 of the best 4 riders in the world at the moment are riders that survived despite their environment. So Vingegaard from Denmark in the flat somehow made it to at least like Conti level, being the smallest guy from the north of Denmark, and Remco as the best time trial rider in the world, best 50-minute power on the TT bike, from being a 65 kilo guy in Belgium.
Yeah, for sure. And let's be honest, in Belgium, like, youth racing doesn't care about time trialing. It's all about crits, omlopen. But I find this a really interesting point. I never thought about this, and I think you're totally right. But do you then think like it's because of the training they do, or is it because like based on their genetics and they're just like long hills in your backyard that those kind of cyclists tend to come up to the surface? You know what I mean? Like,
it's
both.
You're diving into talent identification and talent development, which is a super interesting area, and Patrick speaks to that. You talk about Remco and Jonas, you got to ask yourself the question: how many others are out there that just haven't been in the right system? There's, like I say, it's genetics at the core. If you don't have the right parents, then good luck. But then it's about that environmental exposure. I come from a British system when now there's no lack of British pros in the peloton, but 20 years ago that was relatively far and few between, and that could be just that there was investment in that sport. The Olympic program did well. It attracted kids at the right age. So there are a multitude of factors in that nurture piece that will ultimately give X individual the opportunity to achieve what these guys have done. It's important to consider. So, when the riders we've spoken about, when they do come through the masses and are seen as hugely talented, that's when they start to tailor that training to maximize their potential, their genetic potential, specific to the demands of professional cycling. So, yeah, it's a really interesting one. It just make you wonder how many other Adays are out there.
Yeah, I don't know. Just subjectively, I'm not sure that like every Andorran child is more genetically predisposed to being good on the 45-minute climbs. Maybe they are, but I have the feeling it's and Belgium's the other way. I'm pretty sure Belgium didn't produce a good climber for like 20 years, and they're like, this is strange. And then they started doing a time trial uphill test to identify talent, and they're like, oh, we actually have some good climbers, and now they have Van Aertveld, Uiterbrooks, Remco, and
yeah, exactly. But it's not so. It's not like a kid from Andorra is like genetically more fit to do long threshold efforts. It's the other way around. It's like, what if you're born in Ghent and you're a really good climber? I mean, the fact that Vingegaard made it to the pros, I mean, you need to be so stubborn, so like. The path he's taken through like the continental level is pretty bizarre. So I think that's what David means. Like, it makes you wonder how much Vingegaards are out there that were just maybe a bit unlucky or didn't have the mental capacity that he had to just keep on doing what he did, right?
Yeah, because you're 60 kilos and you're having to race in Kermesses or crits every week on the flat, and you don't get any results.
No.
Exactly. Yeah, I think genetics is a bit more long term. The genetic diversity across Europeans is not. If you want to look at what you're speaking to there, Patrick, is like if you go to like the Sherpas in the Himalayas, for example, they have genetic adaptations that make them suited. So they're always going to have a high hemoglobin mass and be able to tolerate extreme altitude. But if you're comparing against most of the countries that the professional cyclists come from, it's genetically, there's diversity there, and some are more predispositioned to being elite athletes than others, but there's not a massive diversity. But what we're saying there is like, if Jonas had been born and grown up in Andorra, then perhaps he would have been, the chances of him getting to where he's got to would have been much higher versus, he could have quite easily gone under the radar had it not been for a few circumstances. But that's the great thing about sport, right? There's a bit of a story behind it. These guys are outliers, and there needs a certain sequence of events, a certain number of stars to align to get them to where they get to.
But going back to then the amateur athletes, so you should try and see what your general phenotype is, and what you would do that by comparing your power duration curve to I mean, in intervals, it does that where it compares to like your group, your average population. You see, oh, okay, I'm at, without much training, my 5 second to 60 second is at like 75th percentile, but then my 20-minute power is at 30th percentile, and I'm like fairly untrained. That means generally you probably are. That's your type of phenotype, or is that too simplistic and actually your untrained values are not relevant?
No, I think that's spot on.
Okay.
I think there's an intuitive element to that where you say, yeah, I know I'm good at this, I'm not good at that, whether it's because of your body composition or
just the group ride.
Yeah, exactly. So you can pick that up, and this is just a more objective way of confirming that, and then it helps you to target areas you might want to improve or strengths you might want to build on.
Yeah, I totally agree. So you always look at basically like when you look at the data, you're always comparing it to the background, to the history of the bulk of training. You know, if the whole purpose was to increase your 20-minute effort, then you did a lot of threshold work, and yeah, you don't see anything improve there. That's the things you would like to know. But talking about that, what I'm also wondering, because we're talking now about power curves, for example, or peak power curves, how do you look at fatigue resistance? That's like been a major topic over the past, 5 years. Still, I think most people that are on, maybe people that are on intervals, for example, are looking at their fatigue resistance. But it's, for a lot of cyclists out there, it's a pretty difficult metric to grasp, right? What's your opinion?
Sure. Yeah, it's I honestly don't think that it's done in a particularly consistent and accurate way. I mean, for you, Jim, how would you define fatigue resistance, just out of interest?
Well, it depends already, because, there's the durability definition and there's fatigue resistance. But let's say, because in every research out there, for example, they make their own definition about when they look at durability, like, okay, let's take, for example, this 3-hour effort. We do something in the first hour, we do something in the last hour. We measure lactate, we measure oxygen consumption, we measure power output, of course, heart rate, session RPE, all the shebang, and we see how big the difference is, basically. But to keep it really simple, and let's talk about fatigue resistance, the resistance of being able to cope with fatigue. So basically, how much fatigue do we see, for example, in a 5-minute effort when it's done in the first hour, like your peak power output, compared to what you're able to do after a, let's say, 5-hour endurance ride. And then the whole difficulty there is, okay, but do I need to look then at comparing 5-minute efforts, 1-minute efforts, 20-minute efforts, and how often would I even do like a 20-minute effort in the first hour and a 20-minute effort after 5 hours riding? I mean, that's not something I would like to do like every week, right, Patrick? I hope not. So
yeah, I ain't doing that.
It's also about the question, like, but we do know that if, for example, those numbers, that what you're able to do in the first hour and what you're able to do after 4 or 5 hours of racing, if the difference between those numbers is really small, then we actually know it's pretty correlated to, for example, race results or just being an elite cyclist. That's what we know from research. So it is kind of a thing, but it can be interpreted in many ways. It's kind of a thing that you would like to know as a coach or as a cyclist. But what I'm wondering at is, how would you use it from a pretty like practical point of view with the people, with cyclists you coach?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and you make the point there that it's really well correlated with endurance performance, whether that's at the elite level or amateur level. I always ask myself, well, why is that? Why is this important? And I think it's going back to very basic principles. Cycling as a form of human-powered movement is super efficient. Add in drafting. That's why these bike races are so long, because it takes that long to separate out the top from the almost top. That's why it takes, those one-day classics are 5-6 hours long, rather than it being a 1-hour race. And that's linked to fatigue resistance. So there are many athletes out there that can do in a fresh, unfatigued state, fantastic things on the bike, but they can't back that up after 4 or 5 hours of cycling. And that's what we see when we watch the professionals, or if you're riding with your friends, the people we kind of rate as being good are fatigue resistant. Now, how you measure that and how you use that practically is a bit more challenging. So as we've discussed already, you can look at peak power after a given duration, how heart rate changes over time. You can even look at your peak powers in something like Training Peaks WKO platform after a certain amount of energy expended, whether it's 2,000 kilojoules, 3,000. The challenge there is what you do in between. So how are you creating that fatigue? It might be that you do a ride where you're in a race and there's lots of spikes and short efforts, or it might be a ride where you do 4,000 meters of climbing. So there are two different types of ways of accumulating fatigue. So I think if you're going to look at it just from your general training data, it's important to remember the context. So how did I get fatigued that day? One of the simplest things you can do is the same ride. If you live in Andorra and you've got nice climbs, you can repeat a number of climbs and do a test effort on the last climb, the same as the first climb. I've done that with professional riders in the past. Or it might simply be just a case of looking at time spent in zones throughout the ride. But just the easiest way and the most practical way to do that is to look at your physiological response, peak power output, on a given standard training ride. It might be your Saturday morning group ride. It might be your interval session. And then that helps you to see how that tracks over time, as opposed to saying, oh yeah, I did a sportif and it was 5,000 meters of climbing and my 20-minute power dropped by 15%. And then when I did a 3-hour ride and I just did 2 climbs, it was only a 5% drop. So you know what the difference is.
Yeah, so if I understand you correctly, you're also saying like in platforms like WKO or intervals.icu, you often compare whatever kind of power after X amount of kj, but you're saying like, hey, those kjs in between, they're not always the same. They might be the same kjs, but if you've done them in a 4-hour endurance ride, something completely different than with a lot of VO2 max efforts in between, right?
Correct. Yeah. So, from my perspective, it's like, well, how can we improve fatigue resistance, which is, I guess, what we're driving at here. And is it genetic, or is it things like nutrition, hydration, just like general bike skills? If you spend a lot of time in the wind, then you're going to expend more energy. So how you get to that 2,000 kilojoules is super important. And if you get there because you don't eat enough and you deplete quickly, or you spend too much time burning too much energy making accelerations or sitting at the front of the group, there are some simple practical things you can do to improve your fatigue resistance, and then on top of that you can do specific training to complement it.
Yeah that makes sense.
And I would even say, if you're doing a 1-hour crits and that's like really what you do as an amateur cyclist, fatigue resistance could almost be what peak power you can do after 20 times 800 watts for 5 seconds if you're doing if it's a hot dog crit. That's almost the fatigue resistance. It's not really fatigue resistance in the traditional endurance sense of the word, but for your event, it is really like to win the crit is what you can do at minute 55 of 60 after doing 20 sprints already.
Exactly.
Yeah. But even a crit of 1 hour, that is really an endurance event. We cyclists tend to see like 1 hour. Wow.
It's a sprint.
Most sports are like 4 or 5 minute efforts.
Yeah, exactly. Tell a 10K marathon runner, not 10K marathon, a 10K runner doing it in 35, 40 minutes is like, it's not an endurance event. It's only 40 minutes long because you can't bonk in theory. Okay, but that's we're talking about power duration curve, but then there's FTP. How much does FTP really matter for the average cyclist? Because you didn't mention FTP there in terms of fatigue resistance, like, has your FTP increased? But how much does it matter, and how much should you be looking at it even as a proxy for your general fitness improving or not?
Yeah, it's a good point there. I guess understanding the history of FTP is probably crux to that. So I think before we had power meters, cyclists used to do lactate tests where they do a progressive submaximal test, so below their maximum capacity. They do anything from 3 to 6 minute stages at increasingly difficult intensities. You do that in running as well. And when you track blood lactate and VO2 oxygen uptake, you'll see that the particularly with blood lactate, it's not a linear relationship. You get to a point where you start to accumulate that, and that's reflective of the energy systems that you're using and how you rely on those that use oxygen versus those that aren't as oxygen dependent. And that first point, or where you get this sudden increase or accumulation of blood lactate, which is associated with fatigue, is a threshold. Then, of course, if you can measure power as an intensity, then that threshold power is what functional threshold power is. It's the point at which you start to accumulate lactate quicker than you get rid of it in the blood. Why is it important? Well, it's quite closely linked to endurance performance. In a very simplistic way, it's the power you can sustain for an hour, although most testing done in the field is a 20-minute test and you work out 95% of that power. It is on the power duration curve. So we have kind of touched on it, although we've not identified it specifically. So if you are training for an event where there are 1 hour climbs or 20, 30, 40-minute climbs, then it is a power point on that power duration curve that you would look at targeting. But it is ultimately a surrogate measure of lactic threshold. And we use it more so for identifying training zones. So it's well established that zones above and below threshold help you to target specific energy systems and specific components of performance. So that's where we look at that, maybe actually measure it directly with a test 3 or 4 times a year. And then, yes, you can also look at your power data to see how that's changing. So that's why it's also popular, because it's crux to a lot of Training Peaks metrics, normalized power, intensity factor, and then also the performance management chart they have to track training form and fitness over time.
So for amateur cyclists, it's not realistic to go and probably do a lactate test. Not realistic to go to a lab, at least initially, to go do a VO2 max test or various other testing. FTP for setting zones is still fine.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And not only setting zones, but also because in the end, then setting those zones is because of you would like to structure, for example, workouts, or give a workout, or give a workout a certain goal based on whatever intensity, and that intensity should be based on something standardized, and then that FTP, and that's where it gets complicated for a lot of people. The FTP as derived from a test based on lactate, which is basically something like a maximal lactate steady state, which is, let's leave in the middle if a maximal lactate steady state actually exists, is actually a different kind of FTP than, for example, an FTP derived from a 20-minute test. But if the workouts, or your coach or whomever is doing those workouts, if they're making those workouts or setting a purpose of a workout based on a 20-minute test and calling that an FTP, then that's totally fine. As long as you need to standardize something, and whether that something is coming from a lactate test, a 20-minute test. I've seen Stephen Schuyler doing 60-minute tests, for example, just 60-minute testing all out. I mean, you need to be up for it. But as long as you adapt the zones and the workouts accordingly, then that kind of FTP works perfectly fine.
Yeah, and it's the easiest, it depends where you live, but a 20-minute test should be possible for most people. You don't have to do it every week either. So usually there's a 20-minute flat stretch of road without traffic lights, or a 20-minute climb somewhere. 60-minute climb, it's a little bit, that's a little bit tricky. Especially
that's difficult.
If I can do Arculus quicker.
Yeah, for sure. Because if people are doing that, they will probably do it indoors. And a lot of people struggle matching indoor power numbers with outdoor. There are a lot of reasons for that as well. But those are all the factors to take into account, basically. And then still something like FTP, or something like a 20-minute all-out effort. You would like to have some kind of standardized metric that is really closely linked to endurance performance, based on a combination of aerobic and anaerobic capacity, to keep it pretty simple. So it's basically nothing more than just some golden cutoff right in the middle, that says something about both. And in that way, you can use it for a lot of things. But for example, what it's not really good at, like the whole part above FTP, like what kind of power number does someone needs to hit in his sprints based on FTP? Yeah, that's completely different for a lot of people. That's really difficult to derive that number from FTP. Let's say it's impossible, by the way. But I think that's kind of the way to look at it.
It's strange because in pro cycling, it's more looking at like the power duration curve. At least what I look at in terms of analyzing performances a lot more. And to be honest, their FTP can change so much because they're like, if they have an altitude camp, Dauphiné altitude camp, the FTP can change. It even changes within the Tour de France. Like we saw this year. I definitely like their thresholds were changing. At least they went a lot faster at the end of the second week than they could in the first week. Or maybe they didn't have the long climbs to do it. But yeah, it can change a lot for them. So it's more like you think what their FTP was this, and then you look at what they do on Plateau de Bay, and it's like FTP must be a bit higher than we thought before. But yeah, that's a separate discussion. So, Dave, what do you see for the future of data analysis and metrics? What are the things that maybe they haven't been proven at a scientific level yet as being relevant for performance, but what do you think is going to become more important that people are looking at on a ride-by-ride basis and on a training block basis?
It's a great question. I think we've established in this discussion, and we didn't go into the weeds on everything, that there's a lot to talk about in terms of data collected. There's plenty of data collected by amateur cyclists on a weekly basis, and I think the future is trying to weight that in a way that's more useful, like to simplify it, to have a combination of all these different metrics, rather than having to wave your way through 50 or 100 data points or different values, heart rate, FTP, peak power. Is there like it's well established, the compound score? Can we comprise a number of data metrics to represent fatigue or freshness or recovery status or allostatic load, which is kind of wear and tear on the body? So I think the future is first of all simplifying it and understanding how all this data interacts, and can we add them all into one pot and say this is a better representation of your form right now? And then also, what I'm a great believer in, having part of the marginal gains culture back in the day, is that can be a bit distracting. People get lost in the 1%ers, and it's also understanding the weighting of that gain. So what's the most important thing here? Is it the resting heart rate, or is it more important than my 20-minute power? And we can provide people with a weighting of that. So yeah, in summary, simplifying the data into groups that's more meaningful, and then understanding what's the most important.
I totally agree on that as well. Like, what I see often happen is that basically sometimes you have like two variables that explain 80% of the variance of your performance. And then a lot of people would take like, no, let's take into 15 variables, where all those variables, get on all those platforms, use every metric out there. And that explains like 82% or 83% of the variance. And this is not completely made up. It's actually kind of like that. A lot of people need to be aware that you can add like a bunch of extra, whatever, sensors, wearables, trackers, but it only adds up like in tiny amounts to completing, to understanding the variance. And there's still, and for me personally, that's also a big part of coaching or cycling performance, which I like. There's always this part that's like unexplained. And of course, in the future, we would love to explain like everything. But at the same time, as a coach, we do understand like it's not 100% rock solid, like exact science in that sense. You know what I mean? There's some performance that you can't be explained sometimes.
How do you track in your training or in some metrics your internal mental stress from having a bad relationship with your boss or your partner or your siblings or parents or something? I guess you can put it in your you make a note in a diary or something real old school. Maybe people should do that in an Excel, but 99% of people won't do that. So, but that we know that can affect performance. So, and that might be that 80%, and that your heart rate variability. I mean, I'm not one to talk because I'm going on I already told you, Jim, I'm going on a wearables retox, not a detox. I'm gonna try and get all of them and just look at all the data. I know that it doesn't really. I know that I'm training 6-7 hours a week. Like, my heart rate variability changing day to day. It doesn't explain anything. I should just, if I want to get better, just train a little bit more. It's not that complicated. But I also like looking at it.
In a couple of years, we just implant a chip in your brain to see if your relationship is going through rough times or something. No, there's still and I think that's a big part of being a coach as well. You need to talk to the riders you train. I mean, that's a big difference of being a coach, which I'm, for example, at some pro cyclists, as a tool like Join. A tool like Join is not a coach. It provides you with a suggestion what to do next, but it's something different, or it's only a part of what a coach can bring you.
Is that conversations you've had to have with riders or even staff, David, that they suddenly start wearing a wearable and they're telling you, no, I can't do this, or that felt bad, or I'm not ready to train because my HRV this morning says this, so I can't do those intervals, and have you had to then say, listen, we're not changing anything though about the way we're working because of this? Or how have you been working as a head of performance at Israel Premier Tech with people having more wearables?
Thousands of conversations along the same lines. It's a tough one because you feel like you become a bit cynical to these things, these innovations, and then of course a lot of the wearable tech and not so much the tech, but the applications that come with them and the advice they give, is not necessarily tailored to an individual, and is kind of heavy on the marketing side. You guys probably remember Super Sapiens as a method of measuring continuous glucose monitoring, and that sort of was really well marketed and kind of faded away, and everyone jumps on that and they think that's the reason they're not performing. But the best example I can give is a journey I've seen that athletes take, amateur or pros, with this technology. And if you reel it all the way back to power meters, I can see almost in every athlete that there's an initial resistance to it because it's seen to be perhaps making them more accountable. It's more transparent for their coach or their team. And then there's an engagement, and that gets to a certain degree of obsession. So, there's scenarios where guys crashed into a parked car because he's looking at his Garmin, not looking where he's going. Or I know a story of a cyclist who flew to a training camp in Tenerife, and his power meter didn't work, so he flew home because it wasn't worth training without power. So, and then when you kind of go, okay, this is becoming more disruptive, and speaking to Jim's point on 80-20, understanding where the gains come from, it's then when you come back to it, it's super powerful. You've gone through that obsessive compulsive, I need to know my heart rate variability, I need to know my peak power, and I've not got my training load for today. And you say, okay, it's not the be all and end all. It's an objective way to help me calibrate my subjective feelings. So that's when it's super powerful. The guys that get to that point, they say, first and foremost, how do I feel? I'm a biological system. I change day by day. This training session today feels incredibly hard compared to the last one. Maybe it's because I had a bust up with my missus, or maybe it's because I had a few beers and didn't sleep so well. I look at my wearable tech. Yeah, my resting heart rate is 10 beats higher, or my heart rate variability's come down. Or, these things, that's when it's sort of backing up your intuition. That helps guide your thinking and guide your training prescription. And that's the sweet spot there.
Yeah. Would you also say that's kind of like an essential part of getting to that top level, that you that's just an characteristic that you need to have or that you need to develop in order to get to top level performance?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a journey. If you want to do a retox, Patrick, go for it. You'll probably develop some unwanted traits, but it's fundamentally what we deal with as coaches, and whether it's an elite or amateur athlete, it's about behavior change. And this is a really interesting area. And like Jim says, there isn't wearable tech that there is some out there that measures it indirectly, but that's what we're trying to do. And behavior change isn't a linear process. It's up and down, right? So you're helping people trend towards a certain direction to develop behaviors that support them to maximize their potential. And this is where these tools are useful, but one step back, two steps forwards.
Well, if I may add, like, because sometimes I get the question actually a lot, like, let's take an HRV score or a Whoop dashboard, right? If because I'm not against HRV or not against Whoop or anything, I think those tools can be really helpful. But just like you said, like in recalibrating what you feel and also like interpreting it in the right way. Because for a lot of people, like, okay, if the Whoop score is, I believe on top of my head, last time I used it already half a year ago, but if it's like below 20, yeah, then it's pretty clear, hey, there's something, like your recovery score is like below 20%. Then it's like pretty clear, hey, there's something going on here. And maybe you just had a couple of beers, well, probably a lot, or you had a bad night's sleep, or you're getting sick or whatever. Then it's really clear, hey, we need to intervene on a training plan, for example. And when it's above 60, 70%, you probably feel great and there's nothing to worry about. But you would actually like a tool like that to help you somewhere between 20 and let's say 60%, right? Then you would like to have a tool like that can guide you in the right way. So basically what it does between 20 and 60%, it says like, I don't know, please check in with yourself, see if there can be any causes. It's not like, hey, it's 32%, that means this workout needs to be replaced by this or that. That's not how the human body works. And that's something to really take into account with using these tools. They can be really helpful, but you can't like shut off your own thinking and checking into your own feeling completely. And so also with your retox, I would really like to prevent you from doing that. Like, please take into account like your own checking in the morning, for example. Don't stop doing that.
Oh no, I'm lazy. So like, if I feel bad, and if I subjectively feel bad, everyone around me will know it. And then I'm not going to do VO2 max intervals if I feel shit in the morning. So
okay.
And if I feel, but the positive is, it's a bit tongue in cheek. The positive also, especially for amateurs, it's different for pros. You go, you want training compliance, etc. You can't go off and just do what you want every day. But also because my training load as an amateur is not like that intense. It's one hard workout a week. But if I feel good and I want to whack a climb, I'll whack a climb and do a 5-minute test. If I feel good, not because a watch is telling me I feel good.
No, exactly that. But especially for recreational cyclists, after a day's work, you might feel like, hey, I don't want to get up this bike and do these efforts. And then after one effort, and then you think, okay, well, I do this anyway. I will just try it. Let's see how the first interval goes. And after one interval, you're like crushing all your records, for example. That happens a lot. And you don't actually know that beforehand.
Yeah, that bit I struggle with. Waking if I feel really bad. But then, as you say, if you do get the body going, you can surprise yourself. So maybe, sometimes you do need to get the system running. And then
and then if your HRV score says like, no, it's 40%, then you kind of get, you can get in this self-fulfilling prophecy. It's 40%, you feel like, I don't feel like it, and you just skip the workout.
Yeah.
But in an like alternate universe, you would have done the workout, maybe didn't look at a score like that, and you were crushing it. That can happen.
I think that goes back to what you said, David, which is a really important point, is that we're not power meters ourselves. We're complex organisms that maybe I also saw in the show notes you put that machine learning or AI can can understand better, help us understand better the influence of our training on how we're performing or our physiological system is changing. But even then, there's so many different things happening to us in our environment on a daily basis that that's why subjective feel, like you say, is still really important.
Yep, exactly. There's a lot of noise out there.
Yeah. Well, that's been a really, really interesting conversation on data analysis. I guess we've gone from average power all the way through to much more complicated things as well. I found a lot of those points really, really interesting. And thanks, David, for taking the time to have such a long conversation about it. We might even do a follow-up next year. I'm sure there'll be some new, and that's the beauty. That's why I really like it, and I love nerding out on. I used to use Golden Cheetah and things like that back in the day, because every month there's a new metric in cycling because we have so much data, and I'm sure next year there'll be a new one to talk about. So thanks very much for coming on the pod.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Time for our key takeaways from that episode with David. Again, the principle for me is keep it simple, stupid, and that for particularly my level is like intermediate amateur, not doing a huge amount of hours per week, that number one, FTP is fine for setting my zones, and a 20-minute test, I got Tomlin lined up for that, is absolutely fine to set those zones, as well as, I guess, looking at everything as a whole, but without saying, like, heart rate is important, but without then deciding, I need to try and have that as a goal that I improve my heart rate, or specifically or that my aerobic decoupling, if I get that to this number, that means I'm going to be way better. More just, it's stuff to look at, things to monitor maybe without being obsessive about it, but it's not the be all and end all of making me a better cyclist.
No, exactly. I really like this down to earth approach in looking at all those metrics that are out there. It's so easy to overcomplicate things and then just overlook the important parts, basically.
And I think that's because it's almost unrealistic to tell a lot of people, especially if you just like looking at it, it's just say, well, just don't look at that at all. Don't look at your aerobic decoupling. Don't look at intensity factor. Don't look at this. It's like, well, actually, I would like to look at it, but then to also understand this is not the 80% of why you're getting better, or why this ride was like this or that. It's more still understanding the basics of, okay, these are your zones. Is your 20-minute test, is it improving? Okay, if your power's gone up in your 20-minute test under the largely the same conditions, especially if you've done it several times, you're probably improving, and you don't need to get too fixated on this metric or that metric. But yeah, still, I think it's good to also, if people want to wear wearables, because don't tell them, you can't wear it, it's a waste of time. That also doesn't work.
No, exactly. And I think he explained it very well. Like, it's not a matter of you shouldn't look at it. That's not the thing. It's about like, okay, but do you truly understand it? Are you interpreting it in the right manner? And it's pretty difficult if you have like 20 things to look at to understand all those 20 variables. That's basically impossible. But if you can, or if you are on a level that you developed a really good like psychosomatic feedback that you can check into your body, like, okay, how do I feel in the morning? And combine that with HRV, with a sleep tracker, with whatever, then you kind of get this holistic approach in truly understanding what kind of metrics you need to look at, but also the importance factor you need to give in on a daily basis, basically. And so it's not a matter of like, okay, this metric is wrong and this one is right. It's more about, okay, I need to kind of focus on the right things instead of getting distracted by everything.
And yeah, don't get distracted by everything. And the style of the conversation, specificity, or the demands of the event. If you are going to focus on something, if you're doing a 1 hour criterium, okay, then you do need to look at your 5 and 10 second power repeatability. If you're doing a a time trial, you do need to look at the power, your average power you can sustain in TT position. If you're doing a Grand Fondo, you do need to look at how many times you can repeat, say, 3 by 20 minutes, if there's 3 20-minute climbs after 4 hours. So be guided by if you do have an event, be guided by the specific demands of the event to then look at what data, that's the data that's important to see that you're ready for that or improving for that event.
That's really important
takeaway.
For sure.
All right, thanks for listening. As always, that was our data analysis and metrics masterclass with David Bailey. Thanks for joining me again, Jim. If you want to check out the other episodes in the series, you can go to the link down below. That'll take you to the website with all the episodes we have and also coming up. Until the next one, ciao.